Welcome to the Greater Irvine Chamber Business Insights podcast series, where we address challenges and ideas for early stage and entrepreneurial business leaders. Your host today is Dave Coffaro, Interim President and CEO of the Greater Irvine Chamber.
Well, hello, folks, and welcome to the Greater Irvine Chamber podcast series. And what we're going to talk about today, I think, is something that is relevant to every business. Every business goes through go-to-market models and kind of what's the best way for us to show up in the marketplace. Here's the thing. Every business model, every operating model has a finite shelf life. And part of the reason for that is that customers are always changing, their needs are always changing, who they are, the alternatives that they face are changing, competition is changing, and the way that people engage with a service provider or a product provider is changing. So that means that for business leaders, for owners, for founders, there's a need to continually refine their operating model in order to continue to earn relevance, to sustain relevance with their customers. So said another way, if your organization is still operating under the same operating model that you used pre-COVID, it's probably time to revisit it and see how well it fits with the current reality and where you see things going. So with that in mind, today I'm visiting with Henrik Cronqvist. He is the Dean of the Chapman University Argyros School of Business and Economics. And Henrik has been the Dean at Chapman for just about 2 years now. Prior to that, he was Vice Dean at the University of Miami Herbert Business School. And he earned his PhD at the University of Chicago, where his doctoral advisor was Richard Thaler. So it's really an exciting day for behavioral finance folks in the audience. But the focus of our conversation today is on some of the more common forms of business model issues and what to do about them. So Henrik, thanks so much for being with us and really pleased to have you. But let's start with just the basic question. What is a business model?
Well, first of all, Dave, thank you so much for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be with you and your audience and talk a little bit about strategy. And I think, first of all, anyone that talks about strategy that is a business school professor like myself, I think it's sort of required to quote Peter Drucker, I think. And of course, there is, there is a large number of different quotes. The one that I particularly like related to strategy is that it's maybe not a direct quote, but you get the sense of it. He said something along the lines that strategy is a sense of direction around which to pivot or deviate. And I think that's sort of how I always thought about strategy when it comes to making strategic plans for companies. You have a sense of direction, that's your strategy, but then you have to be at any point in time willing and able to pivot and change direction a little bit, sometimes a lot of it, particularly now. I'm sure we will talk a little bit about AI, which for some businesses probably will be super disruptive, and for others will be a great opportunity.
Fantastic way to lead into the conversation. So as you think about how businesses are born and how they evolve over time, at what point in the evolution of a company should leaders start to intentionally think about their go-to-market model, their business model?
I think, early on, of course, you always have to first form the business and in the beginning understand exactly what you're doing. I mean, if you look at research related to new businesses, one thing that has been found is that early on for businesses, the flexibility in terms of where you're actually going with the business is critically important. And you may not know, you have an idea as a founder, but you may not know exactly which direction to go in. So flexibility initially, I think, is super important. But I think, strategy and where strategy can go right or can go wrong, it's important to think about that. And I'd be happy to go into examples when it comes to new companies. And you may remember the company Quibi that was around for a few months or so, and despite having some extremely experienced people involved in it, and they raised billions of dollars to try to launch, but still didn't work out. And then you have other situations where you have a very well-established business that perhaps didn't do enough of a change in direction. I mean, the classical example that I'm certainly not the first to bring it up would be, why is Netflix not Blockbuster, right? And one of them came from nowhere, Netflix, and one had been around for a long time, but they didn't pivot into where the market was going. So those are, I think, my point is that it's important to think about the strategic issues, both for the launch of a new company, but also for the pre-existing ones that have been around for a long time.
So two words that you said that I really want to dig into. You said flexibility and pivot. And I kind of think that's one of the challenges that every business leader faces, is sort of, when are we deviating appropriately? When are we flexing appropriately? Or when are we losing focus? So that sort of leads to the question, are there common themes that you see both in practice or in the research that lead to business model failure? And maybe part of it's inherent in what you've already said, the lack of the ability to pivot, but maybe you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think one thing that you also mentioned early on, Dave, is that I studied behavioral economics back at University of Chicago some 25 years ago. And I did it in the context mainly of financial decision making and financial markets. But one of the things that we know about human behavior in general is that there are certain, what psychologists call cognitive biases that we have. That means that we like to follow trends. And oftentimes that could lead us in the right direction, but not always. It could also lead to spectacular failures. Another thing is status quo bias. We tend to do, why do we do it this way? Well, we don't really know, but we've always done it this way. That's how we do it in this organization. And, of course, that, there's many examples that we can give on how that can steer companies astray. I think Kodak is a good example of that, many years ago were really innovative in the space of photography. And of course, was celebrated for what they did in that space. But I think then ultimately declared bankruptcy, and they were not successful in transitioning fully into the digital photography world. And I think in their particular case as well, they didn't make just money off the cameras themselves, but also through all of these extras that they were selling. And that's, I think, it's hard to give up on all of that and say, hey, we should move away from all of that. We make all this money from the film and all the extras, and we should, embrace the disruption. So I think that those, following the trends and status quo bias are some of the explanations of where business strategy failures can stem from.
So the whole idea of the status quo bias, as a business owner, as a business leader, how can I know if I'm sort of stuck in that if it ain't broke, don't fix it mindset? Things are going along fine right now. Maybe I'm not even aware that there are things starting to emerge that look different for my customers. Kodak, with all those years of great success, it sounds like they missed something. So how do I, as a business leader, become aware of a status quo bias and then do something about it?
Yeah, I think, that's the to say $1 million question would be probably, we would add 3 more zeros and say it's the $1 billion question, right?
Right.
I think it's, and that also goes back to some of Drucker's thinking about, culture. And I think he said, among other things, culture eats strategy for lunch, right? And so to have a culture that is able to pivot and to foster that, but it also shows it's not easy. And I think Kodak is actually a good example of that, because Kodak was a very research-oriented culture, and in many ways a very innovative culture. But somehow, despite having that in the DNA of the company, still didn't manage to, embrace the right kind of new technology. So, but I think it, goes back to the culture and making sure that there are sufficient incentives in place as well for the organization to pay attention to those changes in the competitive landscape. while we're talking about disruption and it can be rather quick and all of that, I think it's rare in reality that these disruptions are so sudden. I mean, we have a quick disrupt, but it's not like an earthquake that just, happens now and then, 5 minutes later, everything has been shaking around. Even with a digital disruption, I mean, still takes enough time to be able to, if there is the ability, if there is the willingness, to be able to do the pivot. So I think it's not so sudden that you cannot do it, but I think it starts with the culture.
So I've got like a dozen questions that come out of that, but one of them is, so assuming that we can start to recognize in ourselves a status quo bias or some other cognitive bias that locks me into, maybe I developed the product my company sells and I love it and I'm just really attached to it, emotionally invested because it's like my child, right? But when we can start to recognize that, then we start looking outside. So that leads to, what are some of the cues and clues that might indicate it's time to rethink our business model, rethink the strategy? What are some of the indicators, leading indicators one might see?
Yeah, I think also the indicators you can see in terms of what's happening to the profit margins, for example, of your different businesses. But I think it's also important, Dave, to also think about the different sort of stakeholders that are involved and that are putting sort of corporate governance pressure on organizations to try to pivot. And these days, and they don't always have a very positive necessarily a reputation, but the activists that we have now in the public markets, we have activist investors that provide some pressure. Sometimes CEOs would argue too much pressure or it's unfair pressure and all of that. But in some cases also nudging, to use another term from behavioral economics, nudging the companies, sometimes gently, sometimes the nudge is a little bit stronger with companies in terms of innovation. And so I think that activists is sort of part of that role. If you look for public companies, if you look at private companies, one thing that has happened during, I think, our lifetime, really in terms of financial markets, is the increased importance of private equity and private equity players, and also providing, you may view the or use the term nudge, and in the sense of keeping the management team alert, responsive to need for change. So I think those are some of the mechanisms that are triggering the change needs. Also, I think another thing, Dave, that is important also to recognize, we like to talk about all of those failures, strategic failures, and the list is long of different companies. Why didn't Sears become Amazon? But on the other side of it is also some of the successes where some companies have utilized their strategic toolbox, and they have been very successful. And hopefully we get a chance to talk about some of the success stories as well, where strategy has helped companies do really, really well.
Well, let's talk about some of those. And you gave a couple of contrasts. Amazon, which has become the huge conglomerate and is in so many different businesses. It's hard to tell what business they're in when you see like 1 million of their trucks on the freeway here in Orange County. Are they in the transportation business and out doing USPS, or are they in the retail business, or are they in the server business or the cloud business? All those different things. But contrasting that, what I love about the Amazon story, and I get not everybody is an Amazon fan, but they started out as a bookstore, a bookseller. And they kind of looked at where there were competencies that they built on and kept building and building and building, and said, how do we take that to the next step? Contrasting that to Sears, as you mentioned. And I believe the statistic is that in early 1970s, they were representative of 1% of the total GDP in the United States. And today, for those of us who live in Orange County, Sears buildings are becoming gymnasiums or something else, or so let's talk about who is a good example, which companies are good examples of those who said, I see a change a coming, and it's time for us to either adapt or perhaps even self-disrupt.
Yeah, I think, those are amazing points. I think, starting with also with conglomerates, which is always been super interesting to me. And conglomerate, of course, means that you're in multiple different lines of business that are unrelated to each other. And I think when you and I grew up, then there was Jack Welch was one of the most celebrated business leaders. For the younger audience may not have heard too much about Jack Welch, but he was, of course, the iconic CEO of General Electric, which was one of very few conglomerates that seemed to be working for a long period of time. And it worked until it didn't work anymore. And whether that was due to Jack Welch or the culture or what it was, I think that is still to be seen. I mean, the conglomerate of today, which we don't talk about Amazon as much as a conglomerate, but they are not only books is the smallest part of their business these days, and then they own Whole Foods, they own Twitch, they own Ring, the security company, and so on. And of course, the most important part, AWS. So I think having a culture that foster the development of new business units, which in the case of Amazon would be AWS, that's largely organically grown within the organization, within Amazon, Amazon Web Services. So that was created internally within the firm. Having a culture that fostered that, having incentives within Amazon that made sure that that was able to emerge and became much bigger than the original business unit of books and so on. I think that is something that is critically important for firms. And then some of the things that they now have had been purchased. So through mergers, acquisitions, that would be Whole Foods would be an example of that. That's a whole different kind of, opens a whole different kind of different doors with mergers and acquisitions that can oftentimes go wrong and not necessarily lead to the kind of synergies strategically that you might be expecting in the first place.
You've used the term incentives a few times, and incentives to, this is my interpretation of what you've said, incentives to innovate or to identify potential disruptors, self-disruption opportunities, things like that. What do you mean by that? What kinds of incentives are you thinking about?
I think everything from a monetary to other things like prestige. I mean, if you had the idea of building a server business within Amazon that was selling books and groceries, I mean, if you think about it, if you're the guy or gal with that idea, and so how do you have a culture that foster that say that's okay, yes, that's okay to do that within this business, and that will be financially rewarded. That will be, positive for the reputation internally for the people that devote their time to doing that. Those are the, incentives that I have in mind. And I think related to that, Dave, I think also another thing that is important in companies is the tolerance for failure. And in innovative companies, and there's quite a bit of research that has been done on this, the idea of, tolerance for failure, meaning that, hey, as long as we work hard and we try our best, not everything that we do will work out and become AWS. It may, become nothing, and that's okay too, as long as at least we thought originally that we were in the right direction. And so in some cases, you may be wrong first, and then later on, you might be right. I think pets.com, remember back during the .com bubble, they had the spectacular, was a Super Bowl commercial, I think, with the puppet and all of that. Right, and then it was considered sort of a spectacular failure at some point. But then I think in the longer term, I think they were right. I mean, I don't have the statistics on, where do people buy their pet food, but I would venture to guess that a lot of it is done through online sales. And so, first you may sometimes be wrong, and then you're right longer term. And it's hard to have cultures within, especially large organizations, that have those incentives in place. It's hard to have a culture that would, tolerate failure, quote unquote failure, I should say. I would say those are some of my reflections.
So I think a takeaway for our audience, which spans small, medium, large businesses, early stage, more mature businesses, is this whole notion of incentives and a culture of innovation, fostering continually reading the environment around you to identify indicators that it might be time to advance, evolve, change our operating model, and be willing to accept failures, setbacks, and recognizing that that's part of it. As a business owner, as a business leader, I know that's not easy. It's hard to take. On the other hand, it's part of positive momentum, positive growth. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. That applies to all of our audience, whether they're the large conglomerates that are part of the chamber or early stage startups. So let's shift over, if we can, to the whole notion of AI. It is one of the most hot topics around these days. How might business leaders explore the introduction of AI into their business operating model or just the way they do business today?
I think that's a very good question. And talking about billion-dollar questions, that would be another one that you're raising right now. My sense is that the first wave of AI's impact on businesses would be mostly on the cost side, on the expense side. And we talk a lot about this in the sense of, okay, well, what jobs exist currently, but they may not exist in 5 years from now because they have been sort of outsourced to AI. So that's probably the first wave. That's on the cost side. And, I think we have to face the reality that that is part of, the creative destruction. And it's always been like that. I mean, it's different now in this wave of AI, but it's always been like that. New technologies, they replace, older technologies. That's part of, the corporate evolution. So that's, I would say, is probably the first wave. It's on the cost side. But that's, of course, not the only place where strategy impacts firms. You also have on the, on the revenue side. And in order to be able to, through AI, be able to enhance the revenue, increase the price, or increase the willingness to pay among your clients, your customers. So that would probably be another wave, and that we're just starting to see right now. And then, of course, another element of strategies also, if you look at the cost side, you look at the revenue side, and then you have the risk and how potentially AI can be used to de-risk a business. I think I have certainly not thought this through myself, so I'm not quite sure exactly how that will evolve. But I think those are some of the touch points where I see AI will impact firms strategically if you look at it really big picture.
I think those are three really important buckets to think about. And as I think about our audience and sort of, where people are focused the most, what we know from our members, they're focused, number one, on growth and then growth of the bottom line. So that speaks to the cost side, to being able to manage those things. There's a dimension to it too, and this is inherent in what I heard you say, Henrik, which is I rarely talk to a business owner, a business leader in our geography that doesn't say they have a challenge with finding the right talent. They can't find the people, they can't fill the jobs, they've got open positions, things like that. So this is a dimension of where AI can help in sort of that getting stuff done. And maybe it's a way to help bridge the gap on the talent side to an extent, but also on the revenue side. Businesses want to grow the top line. They want to find ways to make more sales, make the sales more profitably, but then there's the risk, and that's important. So I like those three buckets. So that kind of speaks to, as you think about your end-to-end operating model, I guess a message that people could take away from this is think about costs first, think about revenue next, and then think about using these tools to de-risk. So really important.
And I think, Dave, on the revenue side, one thing I was recently participating in a panel discussion with someone that is in the advertising space, and you have we all view online, we get served a lot of different advertisements on on Google and other different websites, and one place that I realized through this conversation I had with a few cutting-edge marketing people is that the level of personalization that can happen thanks to AI will be tremendous. And so right now, you and I may be shown the same video content because it's very expensive to produce a video. So you produce the video and then you use that for Dave and you use it for Henrik. But if you're Marriott and if you have a lot of data on Dave's different profile, thanks to the programs that you have signed up for, loyalty programs and so on, and you have a lot of data on Henrik, and if you can produce videos using AI, which soon will happen, that can be personalized to you and to me, so they may actually be quite different. I mean, that is sort of mind-blowing, and that both reduces the cost of producing the video, but most importantly, could grow the top line, because maybe that will make me more excited about another vacation, because it will be tailor-made exactly to me based on my preferences. So it's exciting, and we're at Chapman, we're training the talent of the future. That's what we do in business schools. That's what we do in universities. And my own philosophy is that AI and the tools that come now in this wave that is coming in is we need to educate our youngest members of our corporate community that are about to enter into the workforce to deploy them with these tools. We cannot resist it, in my view, but we have to embrace the tools in a thoughtful way, in an ethical way, of course. But we have to equip our students with these tools so that they can use the tool in their work, and they can, do cutting edge on behalf of the companies in Orange County and beyond, where they get employed.
I think that idea for all of our audience is so powerful. So just to distill what I heard you saying, in a way, AI can help businesses bring mass customization to reality for any size company, any size businesses, right? And that's really cool, because that in a sense, it helps level the playing field. And we were talking about large conglomerates. We know that large companies are great at some stuff, but we also know niche players are fantastic at other stuff. So what a powerful way to sort of capitalize on the technology to help smaller businesses niche their way to greater success through mass customization, through using these tools, leveraging their power, really. That's a very exciting step forward for all businesses. So great comment. So we're coming to the end of our time. And so the last question, which is the hardest one, but I will ask it anyway, what one piece of advice, just one, you only get one piece of advice would you offer business people when it comes to managing their strategy, managing their operating model, and doing so mindfully?
Yeah, I think I think being alert to the environment, what is happening out there. That's sort of obvious advice, I suppose. But then being, if you take this in the context of AI, for example, Dave, I think right now any business, at least if it's a decent size, should be very alert to the environment and have a working group or a set of executives that are thinking about, what does this mean for our business? Where is it going? To monitor the trends and be able to capitalize on those trends rather than being falling a victim to those trends. So that would be my advice, I think, to really be alert to the trends that are happening.
Nobody has to be a victim. We can read what's unfolding. And so I think if we take that, the sort of understanding what's happening in those trends, back to the avoiding the status quo, or at least recognizing our own biases, to sort of free ourselves from the history to be able to navigate the path forward, is a fantastic takeaway. So Henrik Cronqvist, Dean and friend, thank you so much for being here today. Wonderful conversation. Folks, thanks so much for listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you for joining us for the Greater Irvine Chamber Business Insights podcast. To stay informed about upcoming podcasts and other important business news, please subscribe to our channel or check the Greater Irvine Chamber website.